We are all remembering and celebrating. Now, throughout his career, Jimmy Carter was never shy about saying what was on his mind or what he was going against, and going against the popular thing to do. In case in point, when he was governor, Carter, who proclaimed January 15th Martin Luther King Day.
And, you know, during that time, that was pretty challenging to do that, because against the advice of some of his closest aides, he put up King's portrait in the state capitol. 11 Live show Preheim examines the former president's civil rights record with a man who knew him well.
1963 would prove to be a year of change. While Jimmy Carter was just beginning his political career, another famous Georgian was leading a crusade for civil rights. Dr. King's March on Washington did not go unnoticed by the freshman state senator. In an interview with Brenda Wood in 2013, the former president reflected on the atmosphere in America.
Well, the mood was one of self-satisfaction among dominant white people. I would say that we were unaware of the suffering that we were causing by 100 years of racial segregation, where the Supreme Court, the Congress, the Bar Association, the churches all said it's okay. In fact, that's what God wants and so forth, to have separate but equal, so-called. They were separate but unequal.
Carter didn't know Dr. King, but he was watching and listening.
I have a dream today.
Carter has described Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech as one of the best of all time.
And I think that perhaps the most effective speech in history, maybe with the exception of the Sermon on the Mount, you know, was Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. It changed the life beneficially, not only for African Americans, but also for white folks. And it sent a signal all over the world that racial discrimination was no longer permissible or a thing to be ignored.
Marching along with Dr. King was Andrew Young, future UN ambassador under President Carter. Carter and Young didn't know each other in 1963. The two politicians would not meet for 7 more years.
I think I first met President Carter at Pascal's restaurant when he was campaigning for governor in 1970. And I was campaigning for Congress. And the first thing I noticed was he went into the kitchen to shake everybody's hands in the kitchen too. And I realized that I hadn't done that I shook hands with everybody in the restaurant, but I forgot the folk in the kitchen. He didn't forget the folk in the kitchen. And so I admired that.
Jimmy Carter won that election, his second attempt at the governor's mansion. Steve Hockman is a longtime Carter associate.
When President Carter gave his inaugural address, he surprised people by starting out by saying, the time for discrimination is over.
At the end of a long campaign, I believe I know our people of this state as well as anyone could. Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Not only did Governor Carter's inaugural speech in Atlanta surprise people, but it helped to usher in a new chapter.
And so he made it a goal of his to move past the old history.
Carter quickly became a poster child for the New South. Time magazine put Governor Carter on the cover with the headline, "Dixie Whistles a Different Tune." Carter had higher ambitions than the governor's mansion on West Paces Ferry. Although he never met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he became close friends with Martin Luther King Sr. and Coretta Scott King. The King family was an important connection for Carter's campaign and his administration.
This was a challenge for a Southern white governor to show that he was accepted and supported by the African American community. So the King family support and the support of other supporters of Martin Luther King Jr. was very important to him. And during his presidency, he consulted carefully with the Kings and others in the civil rights movement.
Andrew Young had become one of the Carters' high-profile backers. He organized a meeting with Carter and a reluctant black caucus.
They asked him how many black people he had on the staff, and he said, I don't know. So Charlie Rangel said, well, what the hell are we doing here? And then he got up to walk out of the room, and I grabbed him because every other candidate we'd met with had one black staff member, except the most liberal candidate who said he was looking for one. And Carter didn't know how many black people he had. So I went to the door, and Senator Ben Brown was there. And I said, Ben, will you come in and help the governor? How many black staffers do you have in this campaign? He said, right now we just have 27. They couldn't figure it, that he didn't think race. He didn't act race.
As the 39th President of the United States, President Carter also had an integrated cabinet. Andrew Young became the first black ambassador to the United Nations, and Patricia Roberts Harris was appointed the first black female cabinet member as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development.
He had more experience with black people at more levels than most black people, and especially than most white people.
That I will faithfully execute.
When Jimmy Carter took the oath of office in 1977, it was 13 years after the Civil Rights Act, 12 years following the Voting Rights Act, and 9 years after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. While so much of the progress of the civil rights movement had already been made, Ambassador Andrew Young says one of Jimmy Carter's lasting legacies was his impact on race relations.
One of the true civil rights presidents we've had, along with Bill Clinton and Lyndon Johnson, who were Southerners who grew up in the midst of a very complex racial situation and who were determined to deal with it. And I don't know that anybody was more knowledgeable about race, but who also realized that race, peace, economic justice were all intertwined.